Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Biggscraft, and I am the Executive Director and Curator of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum in St. John, New Brunswick. And I would like to welcome you here this evening for the third installment in our lecture series, Travels to Israel. And just as a reminder, although I think we probably all have it now, but in order to make the presentation enjoyable for everyone, I'll just ask everyone to mute their microphones either at the bottom left if you're using a computer or a laptop, or at the upper right if you're on an iPad. So you can click the microphone to mute yourself. For the best viewing and to see the images that I'm going to share later, you can adjust how you see the event by clicking the word view in the upper right corner of your screen if you're on a computer and choosing speaker view. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, we encourage you to do so by using the chat button at the bottom center of the Zoom screen. Anything that's posted there, I will read after the presentation. The lecture is being recorded and we will be sharing it at a later date on the St. John Jewish Historical Museum YouTube channel. And once we have it up, we will send out a link to that page. And just a note for those of you who attended earlier lectures, the first two lectures are now up on the YouTube page. And tomorrow morning when I'm back on my normal spot, I will get those links out to everyone. So this lecture series is part of our new museum exhibit, The View from Damascus Gate, Travels to Israel, 1855 to 2018. This exhibition has been 2 years in the making, from the initial meeting in August 2019 with Cassie Stanley, who introduced us to the photographs taken in the Holy Land by her great-great-grandfather, Reverend William Meade Jones, to now. And in addition to these photographs, we have artifacts of the Jones family brought back with them. And to connect the story to St. John, the exhibit includes stories of travels collected from our museum members and friends. We extend our thanks to all who have shared their stories. Each one represents a different and unique experience. Funding for the creation of the exhibition was provided by the Exhibition Renewal and Museum Activity Support Program through Archaeology and Heritage Branch of the province of New Brunswick. And funding for this lecture series was provided by the Greater St. John Community Foundation. Without their support, none of this would have been possible. This evening's presenter is Teri Levine. Teri moved to St. John in 1972 when she married Ellis and quickly became active in all community affairs, including serving several terms as president of the Share-Zedek Sisterhood and the St. John chapter of Hadassah Witzo. She also had a term as vice president of Congregation Share-Zedek. Beyond the community, she was also president of the St. John Regional Hospital Auxiliary, I think the second person to hold that role, and sat on the board of the Greater St. John Community Foundation, among many other things. She was also the co-chair with Senator Noel Kinsella of the New Brunswick Jewish National Fund dinner in honor of Senator Erminie J. Cohen in November 1998. And Teri now lives in Ottawa. And what Teri is going to share with us is the story of that trip to Israel with Erminie and many other people to follow up on what happened and the results of the Jewish National Fund dinner. And after Teri speaks, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to share a few photographs that were taken on that trip. Not all of them, because we'd be here all night, but just a few that illustrate some of the key points in her story. So Teri, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for those of you who have tuned in. As I said earlier, my memory is not bad, but there are some things I just cannot put together, so please bear with me. The New Brunswick JNF dinner in honor of Senator Erminie Joy Cohen was held in St. John, New Brunswick in October of 1998. When we began planning, we thought it might be a relatively small Negev dinner compared to some of the others that had been held across the country. We were soon to find out that that was not to be the case. Once the word was out that the event was going to happen, the list of attendees began to grow exponentially. Patrons came from all over New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and beyond our maritime borders. Erminie had opened so many doors with her involvement in so many different areas that everyone who had ever worked with her wanted to be a part of this very special tribute to honor her. The Great Hall in Market Square in St. John was full. The dinner was a tremendous success. As a result, JNF decided to lead a trip to Israel to plant the New Brunswick forest, which was Erminie's specific request. She was a proud New Brunswicker. In the fall of the following year, a group of individuals who had attended that dinner flew to Israel to be a part of it. The following people, some expat St. Johners, some from other maritime locations, and some who had come from away, gathered together to plant the New Brunswick forest in Israel. They were Frida April, Lois and Ricardo Basuto, Edmund Boyd, Judy and Arnie Budovich, Senator Erminie Cohen, Reuben Cohen, Mr. and Mrs. Leonard Feynman, who came from Laguna Woods, California, Doug Fifield, Naomi and Dennis Frankenberg from California, Norma Jones, Jenny Kessis, Teri and Ellis Levine, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Liss, Mr. and Mrs. David McPherson, Judy Marr, Libby Schulman, Sis Silver, Lynn Swan, and last but by no means least, Eileen Travis. The trip was structured to be of interest to both Jews and non-Jews, and I think the selection of the sites was well done. There really was something of interest for absolutely everyone. We arrived in Montreal and then flew El Al overnight, arriving in Tel Aviv. On arrival, there were a few people who actually kissed the ground because a visit to the Holy Land was so significant in their lives. Buses were waiting to take us to Jerusalem, where we would begin our tour. We stopped along the Jerusalem road to view the bombed out tanks and artillery, which had been left there as a memorial to the wars Israel had fought in its very short life as a nation. Each person or couple had the opportunity to plant a tree along that highway, which we assume is still there today. As mentioned previously, our group was privileged to be able to tour sites of interest to both Christians and Jews. I don't remember the exact itinerary. Please bear with me. We had an extraordinary guide whose name was Avi. I think he had been a lawyer, but gave up his practice to become a national tour guide for the state of Israel. This required him to take a 3-year course before being certified. He was extremely well-versed and able to respond to all of our questions. And believe me, there were many. He brought the history of Israel to life for all of us. His outstanding knowledge of Israel's place on the world stage at that time made it very easy for all of us to see the future of the country through the eyes of an Israeli and better understand the machinations and dilemmas the country would face in the future. We visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and saw the burial place of Jesus. But while we were waiting outside of this historic site, along with many groups of tourists from all over the world, I noticed a rickety wooden ladder propped up against one wall of the church. I was really exasperated by the fact that this old rickety thing was in the way. So I went to one of the guides and asked about it being there. I was told quite clearly that that ladder had been in the same spot for as long as anyone could remember, and that was the end of that. Full stop. I very quietly went back to our group to relay the message. Who knew? We wandered in the Garden of Gethsemane, stood on the Mount of Olives, and saw the panoramic view of Jerusalem and the Dome of the Rock. It was a moving experience for all of us. We did walk the 14 stations of the cross in the old city, and I was truly moved to watch my friend Eileen Travis with tears streaming down her face in the process. She was totally overcome, saying she never ever dreamed as a young Catholic girl growing up in rural Nova Scotia that this was something she would ever see. She experienced pure joy. At the Tower of David Museum, which in itself was sensational, there was an exhibition by the famous glass artist Chihuly. His sculpture blanketed the courtyards and towers of the entire museum. One of the most beautiful things that I have ever seen were these extraordinary pieces of brightly colored glass sculpture gleaming in the Israeli sunshine. It was absolutely magical. We toured the Herodian mansions. These were excavated homes of the very wealthy who had lived in Jerusalem in the 1st century BC. They lived lives of amazing luxury and opulence, as we could see by the size of the footprint of each of their homes, and also the location in the home of each room. What an amazing opportunity this was for us to take a step back in time. On a personal note here, I have to mention that as we walked through the old city of Jerusalem, it was impossible not to notice the magnitude of contrasts. This was a very Orthodox part of the city. Women wore head coverings and long skirts. All the men and boys had side curls and beards, and their tzitzit were clearly visible. However, it was surreal to see many of these men, usually the younger ones, walking along with a cell phone in one hand, chattering away in Hebrew, and a cigarette in the other. It was almost unbelievable. Another thing that I was stunned to learn about on that trip was that there is a trash issue in Israel. As we walked along the streets, particularly in Tel Aviv, I could not believe the amount of trash thrown on the sidewalks and in the beautiful flower beds that were planted everywhere. Tel Aviv is a bustling, modern city, and the architecture can take your breath away. The best and the brightest have designed and built the most beautiful buildings and streetscapes, and it was showcased by garbage. When we did see a trash can, it was just inside the outer lobby of an office tower with an armed guard standing beside it. Trash cans, apparently, are a favorite spot for terrorists to place explosive devices. At the cemetery on the Mount of Olives, my husband Ellis found the grave of his cousin, Frank O. Garson. His father's mother was a Garson, so this was quite moving for him. During the course of our week, we toured the Arab market in Jerusalem just before the Sabbath and watched as the market was officially closed by the blowing of a trumpet to indicate the end of another week and the beginning of Shabbat. Once that trumpet sounded, you had to leave. No last minute purchases, nothing. It was closed, and that was that. We did not have to be told twice. The process was something to see. We celebrated Erev Shabbat in Jerusalem. We had the very good fortune to be able to gather family and friends from the Maritimes and beyond, and they joined us for dinner. Some had made Aliyah, and some had planned small family reunions, as Ellis and I had. We were thrilled to have cousins from Chicago spend the evening with us. The late Sis Silver was delighted to have her nephew, Dr. Mackie Goldman, and a few of his children join her. Mackie grew up in Fredericton. It was a warm and wonderful experience to celebrate Shabbat in this way. A significant memory for Ellis was walking to shul on Saturday morning and chatting along the way with Reuben Cohen. They went to the great synagogue of Jerusalem and chanted Shabbat services together. It was an experience Ellis will never forget. We toured the Golan Heights and were totally blown away by the history of the heights, as told to us by our amazing guide, Avi. He explained to us how the future of Israel could very well depend on who was able to control the flow of water into the country. Israel's resourcefulness was, and still is, a key factor in its very existence, and without it and a clear view of how the system worked, it would have been a very different place then and now. At Yad Vashem, we participated in a memorial to those who had perished in the Holocaust. As we solemnly wound our way through the exhibits of the belongings of the multitudes who had died in the camps, we were completely overcome by the reality that as a next generation, we must never let this happen again. We saw the avenue of the righteous Gentiles with the names of individuals such as Raoul Wallenberg and Oskar Schindler, and the very brave young lady from Amsterdam, Miep Dinas, who cared for the Frank family while they were in hiding. We spent a day touring Masada. Taking the cable car back and forth, we were able to have a clear and unobstructed view of the surrounding area and understood why it was such an unbelievable fortress. You really could see for miles in any direction, and it was absolutely breathtaking. The Valley of the Lost Communities was quite moving for many on our tour. Families in St. John had come from Dorbian in Lithuania, and it was listed as one of these communities. It was shown on a huge concrete map of pre-war Europe. Ellis's family was one that had come from Dorbian. Several people on our tour wanted to be baptized in the Jordan River. We were quite excited to see the mighty Jordan, and we were totally surprised when we arrived to see a simple stream with all kinds of people in small and large groups being baptized in waist-high water. The river at that point was probably no more than 15 to 20 feet wide, and the water babbled through it like a sparkling brook in the Mediterranean sunshine. What an amazing day that was. On our second to last day in Israel, we headed to the Negev to be a part of the initial planting of the New Brunswick forest. There were several dignitaries who had come from JNF who participated in this ceremony. Erminie spoke and explained that she wanted New Brunswick to be recognized for its amazing support for the state of Israel. Of note here is that when the community in New Brunswick was approached about helping to grow a forest in Israel, the response was off the charts. One of our most generous supporters purchased 12,000 trees to ensure that the New Brunswick forest would always be a significant one. It was truly inspiring, and we were thrilled to be a part of it. After the ceremony, we walked around the area and saw the names of those who had planted trees in the Canada Park forest, many of whom we knew. So we photographed their plaques. Ellis found plaques for trees planted by J.D. Irving Limited and later gave the photos to J.K. Irving. He was genuinely moved. The McCain family plaques were there as well. They too had been generous supporters of the event. During our visit, which was only 1 week in duration, we covered a lot of ground. We visited the Dead Sea, where some of the group could not resist floating in it, spent a night at a beautiful kibbutz, whose name, unfortunately, I don't remember, and delighted in the shops, cafes, and restaurants in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. We crammed a lifetime of memories into those few days, and they will never be forgotten. Over 20 years has passed since that trip to Israel. During that time, many things have happened. Leaders have come and gone. Governments have changed, and politicians have as well. The one thing, though, that is constant is that now and for the future, the nation of Israel and its vast numbers of supporters worldwide are more resolute in their commitment to its survival, no matter what. To all of you, I say, Yisrael Chai. Thank you.
Teri, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing the details of your trip to Israel. And we have in the museum collection an album of photographs that came from that trip. Now, there are probably a couple of hundred pictures in the album, but don't panic. I'm only going to show about 20 of them. So just bear with me here so I can share my screen, hopefully share the right one. Okay, can you see a picture of a bus?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Teri, if you want to comment on any of these as we go through.
That was our transportation from the airport in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this was along the highway. I'm not sure who the other couple is, but the two on my right are Ellis and myself. Yeah, we were planting trees along the Jerusalem road. I think that was taken from the Mount of Olives.
I think so. I can't remember myself.
I rose.
Yeah, probably in.
That was taken in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah, I just have a weakness for roses, so I guess that's why I picked it.
And this was, you can just barely see the top of the Dome of the Rock, but we were on that again was taken from the Garden of Gethsemane, looking over the, yeah. That's our guide, Avi. And the young man with the blue shirt is Ricardo Basuto. And that, I believe, was at the Valley of the Lost Communities. And that, again, is the Valley of the Lost Communities.
And I'm just going to zoom in on this a bit so that we can actually see.
Yes, the
I'll
English
scroll down to the
translation.
English.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure, if you'd like to. I can
This, this memorial commemorates the Jewish communities destroyed by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, and the few which suffered but survived in the shadow of the Holocaust. For more than 1,000 years, Jews lived in Europe, organizing communities to preserve their distinct identity. In periods of relative tranquility, Jewish culture flourished, but in periods of unrest, Jews were forced to flee. Wherever they settled, they endowed the people amongst whom they lived with their talents. Here, their stories will be told. That's our whole group at the Valley of the Lost Communities. That's in the Arab market Friday afternoon. That's the guy with the trumpet.
And here's the trumpet.
And you didn't mess with him. When he blew that thing, you moved. That's all there was to that. And this was just awesome. The flowers in the Arab market were drop dead gorgeous. You wanted to take them all home, and they were very, very inexpensive. That's a view. It's not Tower of David. That's the Jaffa Gate. But I'm not sure where we were when that was taken. And that's the cable car going up to Masada. And that's our whole group again on top of Masada. And you can see in the background, there were people from all over the world. And it just kind of blew our minds away that so many people, I mean, the biggest number of tourists that we saw at all of these attractions were Japanese tourists, everybody with a camera. And there weren't 10 or 20 in their group. There were 10 or 20 groups with 30 and 40 in them. And they were all traveling along like in neat little lines. It was amazing. The whole experience of this trip was mind-blowing because it was very different from the previous trips that I had taken, where our focus was on specifically Hadassah projects. This was different because we had the opportunity to go to other sites besides just the Jewish ones. It was fantastic. That's also from Masada. That's what you saw when you stood on top of Masada. That's the surrounding area from one side, but you could walk around the encampment that was Masada and see that kind of a view all the way around. That's the Herodian mansions, I think, don't you?
I think so.
I think that's the Herodian mansions. And that, for those of you who may not know, is Erminie Cohen, the honoree for the event. The gentleman on the left, or on my right, I guess, was from JNF. Erminie is in the middle, and Naomi Frankenberg is the lady on the other side. At that time, Naomi was president of JNF Canada. And this was the initial unveiling. And these are the names, the plaques of some of the businesses in St. John's that had contributed. J.D. Irving, N.B. Tell, T.S. Sims, Fundy Communications, the Telephone Pioneers, and then there's all kinds of names of individuals underneath that, many of whom I can't actually read.
And that is the last one that I have. So I'm
If I can add just one more thing. The group that we traveled with on this tour was really quite an unusual one, because there were older people and younger people, people who were younger again. There were people who came from California. There were people who came from Halifax, and everywhere in between. A lot of the participants were expat St. Johners, and some were people who had heard about this trip and just decided that they wanted to go. But the one thing that everybody had in common was they wanted to see Israel. And this trip gave us a really good thumbnail sketch of Israel from both a Jewish and a non-Jewish standpoint. It was excellent. It really was.
Well, once again, Teri, I'd like to thank you. And I think your journey will inspire maybe some others to make the trip once the possibility of travel to Israel reopens. And I suspect from what you've said that only by being there can we truly appreciate the history and culture of Israel. So we're happy to be able to share your story with a wider audience.